Hi, Cliff Goldstein here. Welcome to the program, Contending for the Faith. This is part of a series I'm doing entitled Faith in Science, in which we explore some of the issues in science and in faith. And this is important because we're in a day and age where science has achieved a lot of renown. So we want to look at science, what it does, what it cannot do, what it tells us, what it cannot tell us. Because I really think that these are more difficult issues than most people tend to realize. What is science? What are the limitations of science? How does it work? How do we know if a scientific theory is correct? What are some of the misconceptions about science? What kind of hope does science offer us? Or is science something that can be even detrimental to human beings? These are just a few of the many questions that I want to address in this series. But especially, I want to look at science in regard to the question of religious faith. How do faith and science interact? Are they hostile to each other? Can they be harmonized? Or, as some say, do they deal with completely different things? All this and more I plan to explore in this series, as I said, called Faith in Science. Because yes, there is a lot more faith in science than people believe. That is, there's belief in science. There's things, in other words, that you believe in science, but you cannot prove. Science is, at the core, a human endeavor. And as such, it comes with all the weaknesses that humans bring to whatever they do. And one of the biggest weaknesses is simply that we live with a fair amount of uncertainty. I mean, this is reality on everything that we do. Someone once said that nature doesn't give up her secrets easily. Or, in a different context, but somewhat the same idea, Paul says we see through a glass darkly. But whether we're dealing with the things of God, or dealing with the things of science, or dealing with the things of history, or the things of psychology, literature, whatever, we are dealing as human beings. So we are dealing with them with a certain amount of uncertainty. We're dealing with things that we just don't fully understand or know, or really could even prove. Even things that we think we know the most about, that we're the certain about, come with aspects that we don't understand, that leave black holes there. Even some of the simplest things. I want you to listen to this quote from a book called The Beginning of Infinity. Listen to this. Quote, "If you fill a kettle with water and switch it on, all the supercomputers on Earth working for the age of the universe cannot solve the equations that predict what all those water molecules will do, even if we could somehow determine their initial state and that all of the and that of all the outside influences on them, which is itself an intractable task." Now think about that. We're not talking about here what goes on in the inner recesses of the human mind, which is a total mystery to us, or what goes on in the belly of distant stars or the sun. I mean, man alive, all that's very complicated. We're talking here about a pot of water boiling. And what does he say? All the supercomputers in the world working from the age of the universe couldn't tell us what those water molecules will do. Woo! That's kind of heavy. Now, my point is simple. Science, like everything else in life, must to a certain degree be taken on faith because there are vast limitations on what we as humans know or even can know. In fact, in quantum physics, there's a thing called the uncertainty principle. And what it states is that at the most basic level of nature, it's impossible to know certain things about a particle. It's not that our tools are limited or that we don't have access to it. No, it's by the very nature of the particles themselves. Certain things about them just cannot be known. If we know one thing about a particle, such as its position, it's impossible for us to know its velocity. Or if we know its velocity, it's impossible for us to know its position. There is, at the most fundamental level, the bottom right level, a certain uncertainty built right into nature itself, at least at the farthest level we can get to at present. But even if we get away from quantum physics, even if we get into the realm of everyday life, there's a great deal we have to take on faith. Hence the title of the series, Faith in Science. Yes, because science is very much a faith venture, as is most everything we as humans do. Anyway, this title of this talk is called The Rainbow. And I can remember one morning I was driving to work and I saw this beautiful rainbow that just divided the sky. It was a giant McDonald's arch, but only instead of that gross McDonald's yellow, it were the wonderful colors of the rainbow. And as I saw it, I marveled at the beauty, at the covering across the sky. It was beautiful. And at the same time, I thought of the promise that God made to Noah, the one after the flood, the promise that he would never destroy the earth by a flood again, and the rainbow being the symbol of that promise. And he said here, he says, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more be a flood to destroy all flesh. Genesis 9:15. And when I saw that rainbow, I thought about the covenant promise, buriti, my promise. And I smiled because really, in a sense, me just simply being there, being alive to see that rainbow in the sky, and that I or previous generations hadn't been wiped out with a worldwide flood, a mabul, the Hebrew word, helped affirm to me the truth of that covenant promise. Now, I realize, too, that many people, even professed Christians, those who claim to believe in the Bible, would have smiled at my reaction. They might have been a little perplexed at my naivete. I mean, I could just hear them, oh, come on, Cliff. You can't be that naive, can you? The rainbow, a sign of God's covenant promise not to destroy the world with the flood. What are you, 3? Get real. No one takes that seriously anymore. There's no scientific evidence to back that up. Well, there's all sorts of problems here with that thinking. If the flood were only local, because some say the flood was just a local flood. So if the flood were only local, then every rainbow, instead of a sign of God's covenant promise to us, actually becomes a mockery of that promise. Not to do again what he did in Genesis, which was destroy the whole world with a flood. Okay, not some corner of Mesopotamia. If the flood were only local, then God lied to us, because there have been a lot of local floods, and that every one of those rainbows in the sky is a sign of God mocking us. There have been all sorts of floods, okay? So that's the point there. If it was just a local flood, the rainbow becomes a mockery. But also, I sometimes hear professed Christians say, but there's no scientific evidence for a flood, a worldwide flood. Now that's rich, it really is. I wonder, what would evidence for a worldwide flood look like? The Genesis flood was a one-time event, a unique event. Okay, how then is science supposed to dogmatically tell us that there's no scientific evidence for something they cannot examine and replicate? What they could do is they could speculate about what they might think it would be like, and that's fine. But that's all it is, speculation, guesswork about something they know nothing about. What it definitely is not is hardcore scientific proof of anything. Science has no more disproven the worldwide flood than it's disproven the resurrection of Jesus. And yet, as so often is the case, science comes out and says something as highly as speculative as there's no scientific evidence for a worldwide flood, and the Christians, and so many of them, do what they usually do. They just have to bow down before it. Well, science says it, and we can't be a bunch of Bible-thumping hicks. We have to believe what science says. That seems to be the paradigm. But I don't want to go there. That's not where my talk is going. I want to go back to the rainbow. I want to go to the back to the sign of Beriti, my covenant, as God said, the covenant that he would not destroy the world again by a flood. Now, many people can no longer believe that because, well, they say, science has shown us. What's wrong with you? Science has shown us what a rainbow really is. Instead of the ancient myths about being a snake god or a path between heaven and earth that the gods traverse to go back and forth, or about it being the belt of Tyr, the sun god, or whatever people believed, we now, thanks to science, have a decent understanding of what a rainbow is, at least the basic physical interactions that create it. We know that a rainbow occurs when sunlight is both refracted, and reflected in drops of water that disperse the light at various angles. Sometimes I think it's somewhere between 40 and 42%. Light enters a raindrop at one point, is reflected to the back of that drop at another, okay, and then, creating the colors that we see, and even a host of colors that we don't. Each tiny droplet of water or mist acts as like a kind of prism which disperses the light into the various colors. Some of this light reflects back on the droplet and is reflected a second time, and it just spreads out. Drops at different angles send distinctively different colors to the eye. It involves things like refraction, internal reflection, and dispersion, all of which at one level, it's fairly well understood. Again, we think of each of this as millions of drops as tiny prisms, such as we played at when we were kids. This is now how we understand, to at least to some degree, as rainbows are formed. Therefore, the Bible story about the rainbow being a sign of God's covenant is proven false. Right or wrong? Well, I don't know about you, but don't you see something kind of wrong with that kind of thinking? I mean, big time wrong. It's akin to saying something like this. Let's try to put this in more formal logic. When science explains something, it means that God has nothing to do with it. That's point number one. Point number two, science explains rainbows. Therefore, point number three, God has nothing to do with it. This is what formal logic calls a valid argument, but not a sound one. The conclusion might logically follow from the premise, but the premise is wrong, and so the conclusion is wrong as well. I mean, where did we get this idea, very commonly held, that once we have a scientific explanation for something, and please don't get me started on what this notion of what a scientific explanation is. That can be quite controversial, and we'll be looking at that. But where did we get this idea that once science helps us understand the mechanisms, the physical mechanisms of some phenomena, then suddenly, automatically, boop, God drops out of the picture. Now we know how it works physically, therefore, boop, get rid of your creator, get rid of your God. Let me read you a quote from someone who has always been one of my favorite authors. He's the late Christopher Hitchens. He's one of these so-called new atheists, though there's really nothing new about their rantings and ravings. And I always liked Christopher Hitchens' writing. Even after he died, I put his picture on my iPad for a week or two. But you know, he wrote this book called God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And I was it's not one of his better literary moments, and I was sorry to see Hitch go down this path. But anyway, in it, he wrote this. He wrote, religion has run out of its justifications. Thanks to the telescope and to the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. And I thought, what in the world was poor Hitch talking about here? What has the telescope shown us that nullifies the existence of God? What has the microscope shown us that makes the idea of God wrong or irrelevant? In fact, what has science anywhere ever proven? And again, that's a very difficult word. What has science ever proven that negates the existence of God? Well, people sometimes think, well, what about Galileo and the Galileo trial with the church and all that? Look at what happened there and how science disproved teachings of the Bible and God. Well, if you ever study the story of, it's really something, there's so much misinformation about that whole Galileo thing. You know, Galileo, here's the irony, Galileo was accused of heresy for teaching things supposedly that had nothing to do with the Bible. They weren't even in the Bible. He was supposedly teaching things against the Bible, yet they weren't against the Bible. The Bible never talked about these things. Where does the Bible say that the earth sits at the center of the universe and that the planets and stars all orbit around it? Where does the Bible say that? These are either taken directly or inferred from the teachings of Aristotle, which the church had co-opted, and suddenly it becomes teachings of the Bible. Okay? They weren't teachings of the Bible. Galileo was convicted of heresy, not heresy to Paul, not heresy to Moses, not heresy to Jesus, but to the prevailing scientific theory of the time, that of Aristotle, a pagan Greek who had been dead for 2,000 years by then. Anyway, that's a whole other talk. My point for now, though, is this. Where do we get the idea that the minute someone has a scientific explanation, again, a very loaded word, that the minute they have that, whatever they have, that the divine is automatically nullified and or pushed out? How does the fact that we now fairly well understand the physics involved in the making of a rainbow, how does that in any way refute or nullify what the Bible said about the rainbow being a sign of God's covenant with humanity, that he won't destroy the world again by water? Now, if the text had said, and God said, I would create this covenant sign through weaving together angel feathers, and that mixture of angels' feathers would cause this colorful rainbow in the sky. Okay? Now, if Scripture said that, then, I think we might have a bit of a problem, okay? But when I read the Genesis account, and I've read it in Hebrew over and over, it doesn't say anything like that at all. Nor does the Bible record, when it was first created, say that when God put the rainbow in the sky, did it specifically say that it's not going to be created out of water droplets, light reflecting off of water droplets in the sky and acting like prison? Did the text ever say that wouldn't be what it is? No, of course not. I'm being rhetorical here. This, again, the whole idea that, well, now that we know how the rainbow is made, it proves that God had nothing to do with it. That is such a false conclusion. It's an assumption not warranted by the facts. The premises do not lead to the conclusion, because the premise that once something is understood scientifically, it means that God must automatically have nothing to do with it. He must be removed from the picture, is not proven. Where does that come from? It's certainly not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement masquerading as a scientific one. The British poet John Keats feared that science would one day, quote, unweave a rainbow, close quote. But you know, even if we could parse, measure, and predict and quantify everything about a rainbow down to the innards of each photon and to the underbelly of every quark, what would that prove other than that we better understand the natural laws that God used to create the sign of his coveted promise? Science no more removes God from the equation than the action of hormones in the limbic system reduces human love into something akin to the liver secreting bile. Science might one day be able to explain everything about how rainbows are made, even up to 25 digits to the right of the decimal point. But it can never explain why. And you see, this gets into a whole other area in regards to the question of faith in science, especially as science relates to faith. And that is the question of exactly what does science do anyway? Does science really explain why anything happens? I mean, does it give us the real why? Or does it just explain how certain mechanisms appear to work? See, there's a big difference here, and it's something that philosophers of science have been debating for centuries now, or for a long time now. Let's go back to the rainbow. Why does the rainbow appear in the sky? Why? Well, because at the angle of the sunlight hits the water droplets, right? Okay. But why, when the sunlights hit the water droplets at this angle, does the rainbow appear? Well, it has to do with the specific way that light is made and water's made. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. But why is light made in such a way that it interacts with water droplets at a certain angle? You get the rainbow. Well, it has to do with how light waves act. Okay, but then why do light waves, when interacting with this or certain angle, create the rainbow? Well, it's because light waves just act that way. They just do. Huh? They just do? What kind of explanation is that? But you know, it's typical in many ways of all scientific explanations. At some point, your why comes to a dead end, and science can't go further. The why has to stop because you get to the very bottom, at least according to the rule that scientists have made for themselves about what science supposedly can and cannot do entail. But again, why? Where is the why answer to the rainbow? We have a lot of hows, and yes, it's fascinating to think that water and light can mix in such a way and create such a beautiful phenomena as the rainbow really is. But to simply say that the reason it does it is because, well, you know, take it to any of the levels we looked at, even the bottom level, you still don't have a firm why, do you? To say that the nature of light waves is to do that, in a sense, is just going all the way back to Aristotle, who once said something that the reasons rocks fall to the earth is that rocks love the earth. That's why rocks fall to the earth. Well, what is the nature of light waves to do that? even if we got down to the level of the nature of photons themselves, it would still have to be really more only a description than an explanation. And logically, there's no way out of this trap. Science, as is now understood, can take you only so far than the explanations stop without you ever getting a full why. So, I have an explanation. I think I have a why that science can't give you. Why then do rainbows appear in the sky? Because God created our world in such a way that when sunlight and mist are in right relationship to each other, the mist breaks up the light by refracting it and reflecting it at different angles that create these electromagnetic waves, which, when reaching our eyes, laminate the image of rainbows in our head. And he did it, the why that science could never explain, to remind us of his covenant promise that never again would God destroy the world by water. Okay? Now, one could justly argue, and I think they would be fair, that this is not purely a scientific answer. And hey, I agree. It's not purely a scientific answer. Okay? Then that's because it takes us further than where science can take us. Science can, as we saw, explain, at least to a certain level, the hows, how this, how that, but it never really gets to the why. It's not even close. And considering the nature of how it is practiced, science never will get close to it, at least as it's practiced now. Yeah, there's no question that rainbow I saw that morning, that rainbow that was just beautiful, glorious rainbow, and indeed reminded me of what God had said about Beriti, my covenant. That's his covenant with the world, never to destroy the world again with a flood. And yes, here I was, evidence to some, I was seeing evidence to some degree that he had kept his word. And as I looked at it, I thought about all that science had taught us about how the rainbow was formed. Okay? And that's fine. But nothing in science, nothing by any stretch of the imagination showed the reality of how it came, the only true why of how the rainbow was created, and that was God.